also more work to leave and come back than it is to not leave. So I don't leave much, and this was like a trip that had been kicked down the road 4 years due to two COVIDs and healthcare emergencies and different things, so we kind of had to do it or lose it. And when I was in Spain, I drove out to the Dolmen de Menga, which no one else in my party had any interest in seeing, which is a Neolithic dolmen. And I took my daughter, and so I was thinking about that. I was going to talk about that. My daughter Violet is one of my favorite things. She really loves Adventure Time, which is this TV show that deals a whole lot with like fart jokes and then like mythology and Western esoteric magic. And if you've got a kid and you've got to get up at, I don't know, like 5 or 6 in the morning, don't watch Baby Bum. Watch Adventure Time. Like the baby finger, where are you? You're not going to get anything out of that but a migraine. But Adventure Time, which, I don't know, maybe one day I'll write an article about that one because I really love that show. But I wasn't expecting to like it as much as I did, and it's something that we share. But the dolmen really looked a lot like something out of the show Adventure Time. You know, Violet loves mythology. She loves creepy tombs. She loves the idea of like long dead empires. And the Princess Violet stories I tell her at night, there's always like ancient civilizations they're guessing about, you know, what they did or why they did something, but they never quite know. And she's sort of interested in those limits of knowledge. And so she thought this thing was really cool because it is a dolmen, is a portal tomb from the megalithic period where people were making giant things out of stone. This one was a lot older than most of the other ones. Like I've been to Stonehenge, I've been other places. And this one was about 6,000 years old, which is kind of, you wouldn't, I guess, or I didn't expect one of the older ones to be bigger. You would think that architecture, you know, would have moved slowly or progressingly. You know, you start out building small things. Maybe there were small things, we just don't have them. But one of the oldest dolmens that we have, the most impressive is was one of the biggest. So that means that the giant, 8-9 ton rocks that people had to slowly carve out of a mountain and then, move somehow without metal tools, without modern ropes. They probably had some kind of rope. Were pretty wild. And so Violet going into this thing and touching these, giant stones and feeling it was a really neat thing. And what is sort of interesting is the Dolmen de Menga, it doesn't face the summer solstice like a lot of them do. It faces the winter solstice, and it does that so that it can face this mountain that looks like a face. And it looks a whole lot like a face. It's not like you kind of have to squint to see it. Like the mountain even has like an Adam's apple. There's a picture of it on the blog if you want to check it out. But it looks like a giant is like sleeping underground. And it's laying in the ground, that's like another thing that you would find out of Adventure Time. And so, the thing about prehistory is we can't know anything about it because it is before written, history is birthed with the invention of writing. And so before that, there is no writing, at least not writing that we can read. There probably were picture symbols like other things that were, proto-writing. But not that we have, and not that anyone who is a linguist, modern linguist, would consider a language, really. And so a lot of that, everything that we know is just kind of a guess, but you could guess that these people who go to Iberia and then stay in Iberia for a really long time, which like after having been to Spain, you kind of see why they would stay, because like everything in Spain was like fragrant and edible. It was wild. Like, there are obviously a lot of olives when they got there, which we think that it probably took them a long time to figure out how to use them. That's probably not why they stayed. That was a byproduct of them staying. But I went on a hike to see some other Neolithic writing that was a lot newer. Because a lot of the sites, like there's no like gate or anything. You find a GPS point, you hike across somebody's land, you go to like a cave and you go see it. Again, there's a picture of that on the blog. There's a little guy made out of iron oxide It was inside of a cave that I went into, but real small. I mean, cave is generous. It was more like a hole, but like on the hike, I picked pink pepperberries, which I guess that's not a local thing, but there was like these just fennel everywhere that just smelled wonderful. Like having a steak that night, I put some of the pepperberries in my pocket. Like on the hike, got some of the wild garlic. Well, it probably wasn't wild. It probably was growing because there had been a house there like 100 years ago or something. I hiked through what was probably a homestead at one point. And then, we grilled some of the fennel bulbs, the garlic. I found wild sage growing. And it's just like a dry climate with just kind of like sandy soil that not a ton can grow in, but the stuff that grows usually you can eat. And you can see really far. It's just a nice place. You could kind of see why they hung out long enough to figure out something like architecture, which probably took a long time to be able to figure out how to do. So this tomb, if you're not familiar, dolmens are portal tombs. So what it is you get these rocks, some of the ones at this settlement, like the biggest capstone, I think it was like 180 tons, which is just insane. You're talking about people, chiseling out an ice cream sandwich style, shaped like piece of rock, basically, by chiseling everything else away. Like there's no way to cut it directly out of the mountain. You have to remove the mountain around it. And then somehow rolling it, carrying it, lifting it up an earthen ramp, digging up these other stones, putting something there. And having this, what was probably a pretty sacred space. And to say, I hear these debates where people are like, are they religious sites or are they, holy spaces, or were they practically used? Were they used to convey knowledge? And it was like all of it. Like we didn't have disciplines. They didn't have anything. I mean, the thing that is so interesting to me about the birth of architecture, right, is that like when you dig down and you look at that period of history, it is like one of the first biggest technologies, other than maybe language, that like rends the earth apart and makes us different. And nothing can ever be put back the way it was before. Because before that, right, before somebody lugged these stones and made these things, granted, it took lifetimes to do this probably. It took coordination that no one had ever seen before, that you had classes of people that could chart the sun, that could measure that with little rocks, that could convey to the leadership why this was something that would entrench the overall power and progress of mankind, who could coordinate, who could feed the people who were doing this instead of hunting or doing anything else. It was hard work in a time where there wasn't a whole lot of surplus anything. But once you do that, before that, what humanity is nature. They're walking through nature. Maybe there's wood houses that I prop these things up. But if there's a mountain there, right, it's there. And if there's a tree there, it's there. And the world is just this natural thing that I'm encountering as a human, that I'm a part of as a human, that I can't really separate myself from, that I can't really control. The homes that are before this are, maybe you dig down a trench, you put wood over it. But this is just such a temporary little change. And this is a guess. Nothing like that would have lasted. It does in other parts of Europe, so we know that people were probably doing that, but and I'm not an archaeologist, I had a couple of archaeology classes, but we come back on the show a ton to the origin, the intersection of psychotic experience, the collective unconscious, the psychosis and technology, and how technological progress changes what we view as human, changes what we view as the world, changes the way that we hallucinate, changes the way that we create and believe, changes religion. And that these things are so, intertwined together in a way that we can see, but we can't directly understand. We can only intuitively understand that. Maybe that's why I like that so much. And when you have somebody who has seen these structures that are basically wood and mud, and the earth is going to reclaim it, yeah, you propped up a lean-to, but you don't really matter. And then all of a sudden, you see in the center of your society that there is a domed thing that can communicate with the heavens, that can predict what the sun is going to do, because on the day that the sun casts its longest shadow, that shadow reaches all the way through the doorway of this thing that is sort of made to look like nature. Like, we couldn't even conceive of a skyscraper or anything that was like too different from nature at that point. We had to put earth on either side of these rounded, of these like pointed stones with a flat top to make them more natural, to make them more organic, to make them more of a dome. Now, all of these things had earth propped up on both sides that probably had grass and trees and maybe not trees, but like grass and things growing on it and animals walking over it. But there was a hole in the middle that went all the way back to a tomb space. And at the very back, there were bones, and there were ancestors. There were people who were put in there who stayed there forever. And on the longest day, the solstice, this thing could predict, or was made by people who could predict, the stars. The light would shine when it's casting its longest ray, when it's closest down to that horizon, all the way back because of the precise measurement, so that the sunlight would touch the bones that were in the back of the dolmen, making this bridge that, again, everything is a supposition, everything is a guess, we don't know, made them immortal, took their soul to the afterlife, reminded them that they were in communication with a bigger world. But when that dome was made, when somebody carved this thing out of rock that they could look at, and they were like, this isn't going away, this is bigger than me, this isn't mud and sticks, and there were cities of these things, there were longhouses, but the impermanence of them was something that when you saw a dolmen, you knew that the world was different, that the natural space had been forever cut and bifurcated into mankind's claimed space, my tribe's claimed space, and the rest of everything else. If you look at somebody like Iliade Murcha, the comparative religion guy that we talk about a lot, who studied the Aboriginals in Australia and said that religion was about making a center of the world that your existence revolved around, and everything else was not that. Everything else was chaos. And he studied the Aborigines that would have, I think it's called a ginza, but it was like there's a longer name for it too, but it would be either this decorated rock or stick, and they'd put it in the middle of where they camped. And sometimes if it was the stick version, it would hold up the tent that they slept under, that they had the fire under. And when it fell in the morning, it would tell them where to go. And this ginza, or this ritual stone object, was like the center of this nomadic tribe in Australia. But if you look at somebody who's doing comparative religion like that, they get it, because this invention of architecture cracked the earth into two halves that weren't neat. They were what mankind could create on the earth, and I'm looking at something that will be around when I die. Not a story, not a painting that might get erased, not a village that may get burned. I'm looking at a 180-ton stone that's just one part of a whole lot of other 100-ton stones making this building. And from my perspective as a Neolithic person, that is going to be there forever. I just became like a god. And, the effect that would have on psychology, the effect that would have on your identity within a tribe, you just know how this moment all of a sudden separates you from nature and almost like pulls you out of the womb of being like an animal to being something else that's aware of your scope and yourself in a way that we couldn't before we could create something like that. We couldn't be, and now we are. And I'm going to read a poem. This is Wallace Stevens, the Anecdote of the Jar. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it, and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall, and of a port in air, and it took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare, and it did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. What a modernist like Wallace is trying to what Wallace Stevens is trying to say there is like that when you take a unnatural thing into a natural space, all of a sudden everything is unnatural because nature is now only in comparison to this thing. Now the wilderness rises up to it. The wilderness doesn't just rise, it isn't just there. The jar is reflecting nature, and nature is in conversation with this jar that has been put there. They actually made me read this. It was in the front of my algebra textbook at Swanee, which was called, calculus. I'm sorry, not algebra. It was called Calculus, a Liberal Art. And it was like about how, everything in math is a series of reference points. Like one number without other really numbers doesn't really mean anything. It's only when you bring numbers into relationship do they exist. But it's a very liberal arts thing to do. And so, before architecture, the world was this undivided, seamless entity with no clear boundaries between, human and natural environment. And now men feel immortal, and the construction of dolmens and other architectural structures shattered this unified perception, and it created this new paradigm where humans would, actively shape and claim portions of the earth. It changed nations, notions of ownership, built nations. And this claiming of space and erecting structures upon it represented a profound psychological shift as humans began to assert their agency and control over their surroundings. I mean, you had to be there for 1,000 years before it occurs to you to start even, building the structures that can build these structures, the social and political and financial tools to be able to build a dolmen. And when you look at what that would do to a nomadic tribe's conception of ownership. Like, sure, this land's on it, I'm using it, I've used it for a couple generations, these people are farming. If I build a dolmen, I will be here forever. It can predict the sun, it can predict the moon, things that are eternal. That rift, I think, has these long-lasting, implications. And the impact of that on religion was probably very profound. You have this creation of man-made spaces like dolmens that provide this tangible manifestation of human agency and the ability to shape the world. Now, the world is not something that I have to interact with. It is something that the rest of my conversation for the rest of my species' existence will be about what I can do to it. Anecdote of the jar. And Robert Pogue Harrison is an author I like. He wrote Dominion of the Dead, which is probably his best book, at least the best book that I've read. I haven't read Juvenescence and some of the new ones, but he explores architecture in that book, and he talks about how architecture marks this shift in human psychology. Before architecture, humans lived in a natural world where the natural environment was dominant and death was this ever-present reality. And then the invention of architecture allowed humans to create a sense of permanence and stability in the face of the transient nature of life. And that isn't just because the building will be around after I die, right? It is because the building is something that is part of my culture and reminding me when I'm a child and I come into the world, I'm not looking at the natural world and saying I'm a part of that. I'm looking at a Corinthian column and saying I'm part of an empire. Or I'm looking at an Ionic column and saying I'm an Athenian, I'm looking at something when I'm 2 that was here 100 years before I was born. And that changes the way that I think of what I am and what I can be and what humanity is and what God is in this huge way that isn't precise or exact, but it is profound. And, like Harrison talks about how, that idea of architecture. And I love the Dominion of the Dead because it's, 1, incredibly well-researched and plausible, but 2, all of its main points are like completely speculative, but they don't feel like reaches to me. And one of those points is that the invention of architecture probably invented the notion of an afterlife because before I just found myself on this giant ball and I could never explore it, I could never understand it. Some of this is still true. I could never really change it. And then all of a sudden, I get to find this thing that I came upon, and I get to make it different forever. So why do I have to die? Right? Why do I have to die if I can do something that is immortal? Maybe I should be immortal. I'm not saying that architecture actually created an afterlife. I'm saying that it made us realize that an afterlife was something that we could think about enough to speculate spiritually and culturally. Harrison, there's a chunk that I think I've used it a couple times in different things, but he talks about how one of the most unsettling things that you can do to an intuitive is show them a giant crumbling empire building that's just overrun with ivy, because then they realize that they die. Not only does architecture give us an idea for an afterlife, it also, when we're looking at, and I definitely have this when I look at ruins, Violet shares this, with me. I think that's why I wanted her to see the dolmen. When you see ruins and you realize how small you are and how little you matter and how much you will die, in a way that even if you're going to die, you walk through ivy colored, columns and cities that are toppled, and you really feel death as a reality that is hard to feel, otherwise. And the mountain that this thing faces, when you walk out of the Dolmen de Menga, there is that face that I told you about that looks like a sleeping giant. And, maybe they thought it was a dead god. Maybe they thought it was an actual giant. Maybe they just thought that it was symbolic of something and was used in story. Again, prehistory, we don't know. But there was lots of little, inscriptions and trinkets and things found all over that mountain. So they think that probably was a pretty holy place because people were hanging out there enough to drop stuff and write on stuff and what all. But, all of these things, you get into something called Archaeoastrology. And a lot of the people in that space are just total cranks. And the other ones are very serious anthropologists, trying to date their findings by, pulling acid off of rocks and seeing what people ate and whatnot. Some of it gets too granular for me and some of it gets too woo-woo. Fantastical. But they're trying to do math to see, what do these things line up with, in the cosmos? What do they line up with, celestial bodies moving and stars? And then make guesses based on what these people, what their technological ability was, and then what their religious capacity was based on those things. And so that's interesting. I've heard a lot of people say, well, you can't really know that even Stonehenge has anything to do with the sun because you could just be off by 2 inches, and then that would mean the whole, paper that this other guy wrote doesn't work. The math in it doesn't work. And yeah, probably. It's probably very easy to get that wrong. But I also think that it's completely crazy to say they just did it for no reason and they had no knowledge of any kind of astrological movements and no religion. I've also heard people say that paper of we can never know, so we shouldn't think about it. And I don't know that I buy that either. And the other thing is these things were probably painted. There's 2 dolmens left. Because remember, these things are 2,000 years old, at least, and usually way older. So just things don't last, the one that I went to, the first 2 stones are probably completely missing. We can see where they were carved out, but somebody probably just hauled them off to build a castle or something in the medieval period, or a well. Something boring. There's carvings that were made in the medieval period. The Dolmen de Menga has a well in the very back of it, which is weird. You don't see that much. But they drilled a very neat hole about the size of a storm drain cover, 20 meters through bedrock, which is hard, with, either other rocks or pieces of deer antler that were sharpened, which is unbelievable. But, that was completely filled in with just junk. And the junk was a lot of it was medieval Roman and then much more modern than that. So they think that just during several eras, somebody tried to treasure hunt, they're there'll be gold or whatever, they explored, who knows what they found. This wasn't a metallurgic culture, there probably wasn't a lot of gold there, but what we do know, there's 2 dolmens left in Portugal where you can still see the paint, because these things were probably painted. This is very rough rock. It's the kind of rock that looks like, I'm not a geologist, but it looks like when you pour concrete and mix it with pebbles and the pieces of other rock are sticking out of the rock. So it's very rough. So it has to be painted, that you can't, it'd be hard to do a fresco on. But the paintings that we have are squiggly lines, a lot of geometric patterns, diamonds, squares, the things you see in other sort of pre-industrial cultures. And we don't know what they mean. They don't really look like a lot of the writings in caves and different things. They look like people or buffalo or sort of animistic shaman spirits where there's a fusion of a man and an animal. You don't see that in the dolmens. You just see these patterns that were supposed to affect some kind of psychological thing. And what's interesting to me is that, like, yes, this sort of was this birth of humanity, where all of a sudden we were realizing we were alive and separate from nature because we could do something that would never go away, that would have the biggest impact that we could imagine, once we see it. But also, so yeah, it's the birth in that sense. But then probably, like, these things were used in some kind of ritual to simulate a birth, because you are in this incredibly dark space that's inside of a mountain in the darkness, and then you go down a long tunnel from a giant round hole in all of them into sunlight. So imagine the effect of that coming out and facing the full moon or facing the sun, walking towards the sun. Maybe they did that to kings or shamans, something we don't know. But whatever it was, combined with sound and the geometric patterns, this would have been like the most stimulating experience that you probably could have had in this time without, modern instruments and cell phones and all of the spectacle that we have now. So, going back to, we talked about like Peter Sloterdijk before, who basically says that the best way to look at, he's a philosopher, to look at the epochs of humans and to understand them is to look at something called what he calls Anthropotechnics, which is like how people make culture and technology and progress, that they fuse those things together to create these protective spaces. And Sloterdijk says that originally there's this primal sphere, of the earth, and then we crack it, and then we make different tribes and nations and different political affiliations within those nations and families. And yeah, I'm an American, but my people came from Sicily, and really I'm a Sicilian too. And that it becomes to where these spheres are competing, and right now we've lost our real sense of meaning because our identity is like foam, where it used to be bubbles. So that, spherology that he talks about creating and inhabiting spaces, think about this as that first, tomb, yes, but also womb-like space that we made. I don't know. I don't have that much more to say about it. But I do think that this stuff is interesting, and when we think about it, we don't always think about it in that way, especially not when your archaeology teacher's telling you about, which type of beta acid indicates that people like ate corn in the region, instead of just sort of contemplating the nature of the gravity of our history, not just like as people or Americans or something, but like as humans, and the psychology that changed and how much psychology is changing now, like if you want to talk about how, well, the last history's moving so fast and, the speed of technology doubles everything every 2 years and all of that. Like, yeah, okay. But how do you understand that and predict that and interact with that when you're not thinking about anthropology and how much this has happened over history and trying to understand that? Architecture, I think, is this attempt to order space and make meaning out of it in a way that is useful and a way that is affecting, both psychologically and practically. It allows humans to have effect. That's what architecture is. And that's why a dolmen is so interesting. I looked down on the ground when we were at the dolmen, and I noticed that Violet was making like a little house out of the dust, dirt floor, and that she had made like a tiny domed thing. And that then once she had finished it, just because she was nervous and bored, she wasn't trying to make a replication of the structure she was in. And then afterwards, she started to scoop out the inside, and make this kind of domed sphere. And I think these things, like, we think about kids like they're these blank slates, and they're going to get influenced by school or Pokemons or whatever. But really, like, they're born in touch with these things that we lose touch. The unhealthy parts of culture are that we are losing touch with something, not imprinting anything. And I want to keep my kids in touch with these things. This sense of awe and this sense of intellectual humility. I mean, that's why we talk about the limits of what we can't ever know and do know now. When I talk to my kids, and I think kids are closer to this wellspring of archetypes and imaginative potentials than most adults. You know, a lot of therapy, a lot of healing is trying to reintroduce those things to people. It's trying to get beyond a rational bounded ego structure and get back into what's under it, so that it can remember what the ego was for. It's not that we don't need it. It's not that you can live in nirvana. It's that you have to be in touch with something that is bigger than you to know who you are, is one of these tensions. And, you know, I think, you know, my daughter had fear of the dark recently, and I've been taking her to the hammock and like watching the sunset and telling stories and singing songs and like looking at the darkness and talking about my own fear with her. And the kind of things that we see, and talking about this idea that the only things that you see in the darkness that scare you are really parts of yourself that you don't know how to deal with yet. And that you never really know how to deal with all parts of yourself. But that they are all these things that are a reflection of something that you don't understand, that ultimately isn't out there, it's inside of you. And reclaiming those shadows has been something that I've watched empower her, you know. And that isn't, you also have to prepare your kids for practical fears and realities. You know, we do safety planning too. She also knows about stranger danger and all those risks, especially as a girl. I want to make sure that she knows exactly what she deserves and she's able to advocate for herself. And so I don't think you want to teach kids to ever internalize trauma as something that they need to blame themselves for. But when you're looking at fears that are not from a practical thing, fears that come from creativity, fears that come from looking into the woods and seeing strange shapes, what are those shapes? Those are opportunities to know the self. To teach your kids to know who they are. And I watch her understand this connection between, you know, dream and the unknown and creativity, and use the things that scare her in her stories and in her art. Same thing I do with my patients, and same thing that I aspire to keep better touch with myself. And so I guess I'll leave that there. But, you know, a lot of the things that come up at this point in watching a child see how much of herself is her culture and how much of herself is her world and how much of herself is her ego and how much of herself is something else seemed relevant to this discussion of Neolithic whatever. I'll look for a guest. It's very hard to find somebody who's both interesting and not a crank. A lot of the cranks are very interesting. But we'll see. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope there's something interesting here. A little bit more granular information on the blog article, and I'll talk to you soon.